Hello and welcome again to this episode of Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined together again with Dr. Gaven Kerr to discuss the division of the speculative sciences according to Aquinas and how Aquinas understands the relationship between metaphysics and what we might call today natural theology. Dr. Kerr, thank you so much for joining with us.
That's great. Not a problem. Always a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm, looking forward to having a wee chat with you this evening.
Me as well. How have things been? Have you been working on any projects lately or articles? I saw that I think on Facebook that St. Patrick's College is going to be hosting a conference in April of next year.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been busy. I'm currently bringing to completion an article of a paper which I delivered at a conference we had here at St. Patrick's on the First Vatican Council just before the summer. A number of us each took a chapter from the document De Filius from the First Vatican Council and delivered a paper on it. And I delivered a paper on the chapter on faith. So I'm bringing to completion that article on the chapter on faith. And, all these articles are going to be brought together and published together. So that's been kind of what's been drawing my attention at the minute. So more long-term projects like the book I'm writing on classical theism and the introductory book on the 5 ways, they're put on hold just the last few weeks while I bring this article to completion. And also been teaching a lot. We're back, in the semester, doing a lot of teaching and, engaging with students. But you're right, we do have a big conference coming up at St. Patrick's on the 27th to the 30th of April, 2022 next year. So that's coming up here at St. Patrick's Maynooth. It's just a ton of major speakers coming along to it. So I would really recommend it. I'm going to be speaking at it, but we have Dula Klima from Fordham. We have Cyril O'Regan, John Canassis, Patrick Lee, William Desmond, Connor Cunningham, David Bentley Hart, Judith Wuth, Eleanor Stump's going to be speaking at it, Rudy Tevelde, David Schindler, Thomas Joseph Wright, Rowan Williams, all these and more are going to be speaking at it. So all these big names, and they're all speaking on the theme of the future of Christian thinking. So philosophical approaches, theological approaches, metaphysical approaches, phenomenological approaches. So it's going to be a real great mix, and people can book in for the full conference. It lasts for the 3 days, I think. Yeah, it's the 27th to the 30th. So for 3 days, people can book in for the full thing, or they can just book in for one day, one day, and they'll get to several sessions through the day. And I think there's about 8 speakers a day, something like that. So the days are quite packed. So even if you do book for one day, you're going to get a full conference experience on that day. Plus, you'll be in Maynooth in Ireland, it's scenic, it's picturesque, it's the nice old college buildings, some of them designed by Pugin, so God's architect, with the nice gardens, and, you're just outside of Dublin as well. So if you only come for one day, you can head into Dublin and experience, Dublin. So there's no reason not to come along. But there's a wee plug for the conference anyway. So, but that's what we have coming up end of April, 2022.
Nice. Yeah, I'll be sure to put some links in the information on the video's description about that because it sounds really impressive.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you.
So I was thinking that as we said, we're going to be discussing how Aquinas understands science and specifically the speculative sciences and in metaphysics. I figured we would first discuss maybe sciences in general, and then discuss the division of speculative and practical, and then go into how Aquinas divides the speculative sciences.
Yeah.
And then I thought we could discuss how exactly God as a first principle is related to metaphysics, and then maybe go into the separatio. And I think that this is all doable.
Yeah. Happy to do that. Yeah. So, shall we dive in?
I think so. Yeah. So if I may ask, what for Aquinas is a science, and what makes a science to be a science for Thomas Aquinas?
Yeah. Okay. So no problem. So a science is a particular discipline which delivers us knowledge by means of demonstration. So we attain knowledge demonstratively. The knowledge in the science is demonstrative. Now, what does that mean? Well, the key emphasis here is on demonstrative, because we can have knowledge of anything. My wife can tell me that she's going to, I go back home on Thursday. My wife can tell me, she'll be there after she picks up the kids from school and from creche, right? So I have knowledge that my wife and my kids are going to be there at home waiting, well, maybe not waiting for me on Thursday, but they'll be there at home on Thursday, when I arrive home. Cool. So I've got knowledge of that, but that's not demonstrative knowledge of that. Okay. I can't really form, a syllogism to establish that. So what Aquinas holds as science is that it's some discipline which proceeds by means of demonstration to give us knowledge as a conclusion. So basically, sciences justify their conclusions, and the particular way in which sciences justify their conclusions is more or less the way Aristotle articulated in the posterior analytics. So they reason syllogistically, and there's a particular way in which the premises are placed in the syllogism to arrive at a conclusion. So, Aristotle has this very articulate sort of notion of, a demonstration with particular types of premises, not just any premises, but particular types of premises and particular ways in which they're related with the middle term in each of them, which brings about the conclusion. And this is what's called a demonstrative syllogism. That's what the posterior analytics about. But for Thomas, a science is some sort of discipline with a subject matter about which we have knowledge, and then we use demonstrations to get us that knowledge.
Is it then the case that for science, for Aquinas, science is somehow necessary, or is it sort of necessarily to be the case type of knowledge? Or
yeah. So the knowledge that is delivered in a science, demonstrative knowledge, it's both necessary and universal. But we need to remember here that when we talk about necessary and universal here, we're not talking in an absolute sense. Okay, so it's a conditioned necessity and a conditioned universality, because the point here within Aquinas's and Aristotle's epistemological thought is that what is known has some element of necessity to it. So it's not the case that it's just true today, but false tomorrow. So something which is known, let's say, good examples always come from mathematics. So some sort of truth known in geometry isn't just true on one day and false on another. If it's true, it's true. And that's the case, and it remains true, even if it's time indexed. So even if we say it was true on the 23rd of November at such and such a time that we were talking, well, that's just true, and it's going to be true tomorrow as long as we give that time index to it, and so on and so forth. So there's a necessity there to it, a conditional necessity, but a necessity nonetheless, that given that it is the case, it can't be otherwise. And there's a universality to it, such that there's some kind of conceptual content which designates the intelligibility of what is known. And that conceptual content signifies a kind of universality. So with regard to the two of us talking, we describe that and we talk about that situation in terms of concepts. So you've got two persons engaged in speech acts. And so concepts are involved there, and that employs some kind of universality, which this particular situation falls under. So there's some sort of necessity and universality which pertains to the knowledge which comes about in a demonstrative science.
So as I also understand it, Aquinas sort of distinguishes the sciences into the speculative and the practical. And
yes,
there's this quote from the De Veritate where he says that they're sort of distinguished because of the ends for which they seek out. It says, quote, "The theoretical or speculative intellect is properly distinguished from the operative or practical intellect by the fact that the speculative intellect has for its end the truth that it contemplates, while the practical intellect directs the truth under consideration to activity as to an end," end quote. So it seems that the speculative sciences are sort of sought after for their own sake, whereas practical sciences are the knowledge that you acquire, you can implement into your day-to-day life. Or is that how Aquinas seems to? Okay.
Yeah, that's more or less correct. So given that given science seeks to give us knowledge, the way in which we're going to generally divide the sciences and then go on specifically to divide them is by distinguishing what is knowable or the ways in which things can be known. And there's two ways in which things can be known. In one way, they can be known in a speculative, or we would say contemplative sort of way. So the objects which are known in such a science, the subject matter of a science is simply thought about, okay? And we call that a theoretical or a speculative science. So we simply contemplate the truth in that science of the subject matter just for the sake of that truth. But then in a practical science, we take some truth that we already know, and then we put it into practice. We do something with it. We engage in practical activity on the basis of that truth. And then you have practical sciences, which deliver us practical knowledge. So we have speculative knowledge that we get in speculative sciences, and we have practical knowledge, which we get in practical sciences. And that's a very general division of the sciences. And then what Thomas goes on to do is he takes the speculative, that speculative branch, and he argues, well, look, insofar as, you know, we distinguish sciences based on the knowability of their subject matter, how their subject matter is known, he goes to subdivide the speculative sciences into three, based on three different domains of subject matter, which can be known in a speculative fashion.
All right, then. Well, maybe then we can sort of dive into how Aquinas divides the subject matter of the different speculative sciences. As I understand it, Aquinas sort of holds that there are preconditions for a speculative science. It has to be, it entails the separability from matter and motion.
So, yeah. So remember we were saying that knowledge involves some kind of necessity and universality. So something is going to be knowable to the degree to which it is necessary and universal. The less necessary and less universal it is, the less knowable it is, because knowledge involves necessity and universality. So the less necessary and less universal it is, the less knowable it is. The more necessary and more universal it is, the more knowable it is. So we'll take a particular example. You know, the contents of my mind in any one day can change from moment to moment, and I dare say it's the same for anybody engaged in academia. So the contents, you know, of what I'm thinking about, you know, change from day to day. Now, there is some sort of content there at some moment, and given that it's that content at that time, it cannot at that moment be otherwise, and it can be captured under concepts, some conceptual content. So there's a universality to it. So the content of my mind is knowable, but it's a very fleeting knowability. It is knowable, but very, very fleeting, because it can change, immediately. I could be thinking about something else. So that's very fleeting, very little universality and necessity to it. But then you take something like Euclid's geometry, which is dealing, let's say, with geometrical figures, the angles within sides, these geometrical figures, the angles within inside a circle, all of that in the first few books of Euclid's geometry. And you're dealing with things which have a greater degree of necessity, a greater degree of can't be otherwise, and a greater degree of universality. And given that greater degree of necessity and universality, there's a greater degree of knowability. So the way Thomas is going to divide the speculative sciences then is he's going to consider the degrees of knowability which are dependent on the degrees of necessity and universality which pertain to their subject matter. Now, how do we figure out the degrees of knowability, i.e. necessity and universality pertaining to the subject matter? In other words, how do we distinguish subject matters here? And the way what Aquinas says is that things are necessary and universal, more or less, depending on how they're conditioned by matter and motion. So if something is more conditioned by matter and motion, it's less necessary and less universal. But if it's less conditioned by matter and motion, it's more necessary and more universal. So the more something is related to matter and motion, the less necessary, universal, and thus less knowable it's going to be. The more something or the less something is related to matter and motion, the more necessary, universal, and thus knowable it's going to be. And on the basis of this principle, he divides up the speculative sciences. Would you like me to go on and go into those divisions?
Yes, please.
Not a problem. Okay. So he starts by saying, look, there are some objects that can be known which depend on matter and motion in order to be and in order to be understood. So these objects they can't exist without matter and motion, and they can't be understood without their matter and motion. So they are supremely conditioned by matter and motion. They can't even be thought about without matter and motion. They can't exist and can't even be thought about without matter and motion. So they're supremely dependent on matter and motion. So they're least knowable. And so this is going to be the first division. This is the first kind of speculative object that we can think about. And the objects of natural science or physics are these sorts of objects, because the objects of natural science or physics depend on matter and motion, both to be and in order to be understood. So, natural scientists, they're dealing with physical things which exist in matter and motion, and in the very intelligibility of those physical things, matter and motion are involved. So matter and motion are written into the very intelligibility of the things that natural science and physics deals with. So that's the first science. That's the lowest science, dealing with the least knowable objects. But then we move on to objects which depend on matter and motion for their existence, certainly, but not for being understood. So these objects, they depend on matter and motion in order to be, but not in order to be understood. And this is the objects of mathematics. So I was talking about Euclid there. Take geometrical figures, okay? Mm-hmm. Geometrical figures don't exist in some sort of Platonic noetic heaven, according to Thomas. He's an Aristotelian about mathematics. He's not a Platonist. Mm-hmm. So these geometrical figures, they don't exist anywhere but in physical things. So geometrical figures can't exist anywhere but in things which are subject to matter and motion. Okay. So these objects depend on matter and motion for their existence. But can we understand them without their matter and motion? Yes, we can. Because when we're understanding, say, the nature of a circle is a locus of coplanar points equidistant from a center. It doesn't matter what the matter and motion of the circle is. It doesn't matter that the circle is like the circle of a clock face or a cup or some circle that you've drawn on a page. And it doesn't matter that the circle could be the wheel of the car, which is engaged in motion. It doesn't matter. The essence is the same. So how we understand them doesn't involve their matter and motion. So they can't exist without their matter and motion, but we can understand them without their matter and motion. So they're a degree separated from matter and motion. They're separated from matter and motion to a greater degree than the objects of physics are. So the objects of mathematics are more knowable than the objects of physics. But then there is a kind of objects which depend on matter and motion, neither for their being nor for their being understood. So these objects, they don't depend on matter and motion in order to exist, and they don't depend on matter and motion in order to be understood. So matter and motion doesn't enter into their intelligibility. Now, Thomas subdivides this into two kinds of objects. These are immaterial objects, okay? And remember, when we say objects, we mean objects of thought, things that we can think about and inquire into as a subject matter for science. He subdivides this third class, and he says, these immaterial objects, some of them could never be found in matter and motion. They're just such that they just cannot be found to be bound up with matter and motion. And John Whipple uses the terminology of the positively immaterial. These are immaterial in a positive sense, such that their entire being excludes matter and motion. And that would be God and the angels, okay? They would be positively immaterial. But there are other objects that we can think about, which are such that they're found amongst things which are material and in motion, but they need not be, okay? It's not necessary that they're found amongst things subject to matter and motion. So yes, insofar as material things exist, these sort of immaterial objects are found amongst the things subject to matter and motion. But even if material things didn't exist, Aquinas argues that these immaterial objects would still pertain, would still be found to be. And what he has in mind are the categories of being: substance, potency, form, act, that sort of thing. So we have material objects, and they are substances, they have potencies, they have form, they have actuality. But even if you didn't have material beings, and if you only had immaterial beings, substance, potency, form, and act would still apply. So this category of immateriality it crosses the divide between the immaterial and the material. It's not exclusively material. It could also apply to the immaterial, even if the immaterial doesn't exist. These categories are such that they're not exclusively associated with things subject to matter and motion. And so Whipple uses the terminology here of the neutrally immaterial. They're found amongst material things, but they need not be. Now, insofar as these categories apply to anything material or immaterial, if the immaterial exists, then they simply apply to things in their being. They simply apply to being as such, because they cross the divide between material and immaterial being, and so they cover the whole scope of being. So a study of these neutrally immaterial will be a study of being as it is in itself. Aquinas argues that first philosophy, and that's important to call this first or primary philosophy, because that's going to come up in this sort of stuff that we want to talk about at the end. Is Thomas doing, meta-metaphysics here, and, where does epistemology fit into this?
Right.
This first or this primary philosophy considers these categories without which, these categories which are the conditions for the possibility of being, these categories without which nothing would be. Metaphysics or first philosophy considers that. Theology, the theology of sacred scripture, which deals, with revelation, comes after first philosophy. Okay. And that deals with what's positively immaterial. Why does that deal with what's positively immaterial? Because we can't deal with the positively immaterial as a subject matter, because we have no experience of that subject matter. That subject matter is not proportionate to our intellects. So we have no direct experience of God or angels as that subject matter. We only have knowledge of them as they are revealed to us. And so we have then next after metaphysics, theology, which makes use of sacred scripture in considering this subject matter, the positively immaterial. But prior to theology, but after physics and mathematics, you have metaphysics or first philosophy, which deals with these categories, which signify the conditions for the possibility of being. And those are the speculative sciences. That's how Thomas characterizes them. And you can see that they're hierarchical. Starts with what's least knowable and moves up to what's most knowable.
Okay, so that's what you mean when you say that one's lower and one's higher. We're speaking to our order of understanding.
Yeah. Greater degree of knowability. Yeah.
All right, then. Well, if I can ask, then is there a fourth or is this an exhaustive list for Aquinas, and is there a fourth speculative science where the subject matter depends on matter and motion to understand, but not to exist?
Yeah. So, I mean, if there were any sort of fourth speculative science, it would have to deal with a subject matter which depends on matter and motion in order to be understood, but not in order to exist. But that's weird, because how could something be dependent on matter and motion to be understood, but not to exist? Surely when you understand something, you understand, so your understanding signifies something essential to its being. But if your understanding involves matter and motion, then surely matter and motion in some way are essential to its being and thus must pertain to its existence. So there couldn't be a fourth subject matter for, a fourth speculative science for Thomas. So this list is exhaustive for him.
Gotcha. All right, then. Well, so we discussed sort of the subject matter of metaphysics as neutrally immaterial, and discussed how theology is what's positively immaterial, and it's sort of dependent upon God's self-disclosure and divine revelation.
Yeah.
But is God at all, with respect to metaphysics, is God at all contained in the subject matter of metaphysics? And if he isn't, then is God somehow indirectly related to the subject matter of metaphysics? It seems that Aristotle, when he's discussing, I think it's in book 6 of the Metaphysics, where he discusses what's eternal and immutable, these sort of substances, they too are sort of an object of study, and I think he calls it theology. But the question is, okay, how does theology relate to metaphysics? And that's one of a problem that Aquinas has to answer. And I think he and Avicenna have a very interesting way of answering it.
Yeah. So as we were saying, the subject matter of metaphysics is the neutrally immaterial. So those categories without which nothing would be. It's not the positively immaterial. So it's not God or angels or anything like that, because revelation is needed in order to know those as a subject matter. So the subject matter of metaphysics, Thomas is quite clear, it excludes God. That which we directly investigate in metaphysics does not include God. Okay, so God is not included in the subject matter of metaphysics. He calls the subject matter of metaphysics ens commune, and that just means the common being that all things have. Now, the common being here is ens. It's not esse. Esse commune is something different. But ens commune is the common being that all beings enjoy. And that ens commune is really just those various categories that Thomas outlines as the neutrally immaterial, so substance, potency, form, act, that sort of thing. All those categories which are common to all beings is the subject matter of metaphysics. So that's what the metaphysician studies as a subject, because being ends, the reality of things, is that, following on from Avicenna, that's what the intellect first conceives. In other words, that's what brings the intellect into operation. When we engage with an experience in the world, in our perceptual awareness, our intellect is immediately engaged with that world. And that world is intelligible because the content of our perception is the content of our knowledge. So our knowing faculties are brought into operation by this intelligible world and all those intelligible features of it, such as, the neutrally immaterial that the metaphysician investigates. So that's what's investigated primarily as a subject matter in metaphysics. But the metaphysician, as we well know, can demonstrate God's existence. We can know God's existence not directly as a subject matter in metaphysics, but as the cause of our subject matter. In other words, we can know of the existence of God as the cause of the being of things, as the cause without which nothing would be. So whilst we can't start with God in the subject matter of metaphysics, we can certainly conclude to the existence of God as a principle and cause of the subject. That's not a problem. So we can't start with God as the subject matter, but we can certainly arrive at God as a conclusion. And, this is what Thomas, rigorously does in all his demonstrations of God. They're all metaphysical, and they're metaphysical precisely because of his thinking here on the divisions of the sciences and the subject matters of the sciences, that God is not contained within the subject matter of metaphysics, because then there would have to be a proof of God which would come before metaphysics, i.e., which would come in physics. And I know there's a there's a bit of a discussion of that, and there's different schools of Thomism on that, which I know we're going to get into and get chatting about. But at least, from Aquinas' account of the division of the speculative sciences, he's very clear that God comes in as a conclusion, not as a conclusion, i.e., as the cause of the subject matter, but not as part of the subject matter itself.
Right. And I've got a quotation from Aquinas' commentary on Boethius' De Trinitate, where he says, quote, we must realize indeed that if a science considers a subject genus, it must investigate the principles of that genus, since science is perfected only through knowledge of principles, as the philosopher explains in the beginning of the Physics. So we sort of understand, we sort of come to an understanding of God as sort of indirectly related to the subject matter of metaphysics as a first principle for all things in existence.
Exactly. We have the subject genus, which is ens commune. Now, that doesn't mean that being is a genus now, so I mean, we get into that. It just means a subject genus, i.e. a subject matter. So we have that subject matter, ens commune, and in investigating that, at some point, we need to investigate the principles or causes of that, and that leads us to consider God as a conclusion in metaphysics, not as known prior to metaphysics.
All right, so I think maybe now we could sort of dive into the discovery of sort of being as being. And as I understand it, Aquinas sees that abstraction is how we come to understand the subject matter of mathematics and physics, But for metaphysics, he employs what's called separatio.
Yeah,
and
he does.
Maybe we could go into that as well.
Yeah. So the subject matters of both physics and mathematics, they exist in matter and motion. Okay, so they can't escape matter and motion. Even in mathematics, we can understand that subject matter without the matter and motion, but the subject matter can't exist without the matter and motion. Similarly, in physics, when we understand that subject matter, the understanding has to involve the matter and motion in some way. Now, it has to make it intelligible, and so it has to kind of, think of it, in a universal fashion with conceptual content, but it's still understanding things subject to matter and motion for their intelligibility. So in order to do that, we have to abstract from their matter and motion. So when we formulate physical laws, when we formulate, theories in mathematics, we're abstracting from the matter and motion of their subject matter. So we pass over the individual particularizing conditions of the matter and motion and think about the thing and its intelligibility more universally. So we pass over that matter and motion, and that's a kind of sort of mental activity that Aquinas calls abstraction. And the reason why he calls it that is just because we're abstracting over the conditions of matter and motion. But when it comes to the subject matter of metaphysics, because it's the neutrally immaterial, okay, so it's those categories of being without which something wouldn't be. And so they're applicable just as much to material things as they are to immaterial things. Okay, they're found to be amongst things subject to matter and motion, but they're also, if immaterial things exist, if the positively immaterial exist, they would be found to be amongst the positively immaterial as well, because angels are substances, God is actuality, angels have potency, form, and all the rest. So those immaterial substances, they are subject in some degree or other to these categories. Okay, so these categories are not essentially bound up with matter and motion. That being the case, it's not enough that we just abstract from matter and motion, because if we abstract from matter and motion, we're abstracting some sort of intelligible content from that matter and motion. So it's never going to be a consideration of being as it is in itself, of being qua being. It's also always going to be a consideration of some sort of intelligible content which pertains to this subject matter, subject to these material conditions. So it's always going to be abstraction from some, particular domain of being subject to matter and motion. So abstraction is never going to get us to the subject matter being of metaphysics, being as being. And so it's a different kind of thinking that we engage in. And Aquinas calls this separatio. And the reason why he uses the term separation is basically because these categories are separable from matter and motion. They're not essentially bound up with matter and motion. And so they can be separated from matter and motion and considered in themselves. So we can consider substance, potency, form, and act without having to consider the matter and motion with which they are bound up. So we're not having to abstract from that matter and motion. So we can separate these intelligible categories. And in thinking about those, we're thinking about the subject matter of metaphysics. And so we do metaphysics, by a special kind of thinking or reflection on the nature of being as such. And that's what separatio is for Aquinas.
Gotcha. All right, then. Well, does Aquinas need to justify this separatio through at all maybe a demonstration of immaterial substances? I could be mistaken, but I think River Forest Thomists may make this case that prior to coming to the subject matter of metaphysics, we're able to we demonstrate a sort of immaterial first principle in the physics. Maybe it's like a separated substance, and then come to a realization that, all right, being and these general modes of being don't merely apply to the material, they could also apply to the immaterial. And so through a sort of demonstration of a first principle, we can come to a separatio. But do you think that's Aquinas's methodology, or do you think it's something different?
No, I think it's something different. So that River Forest school and people generally influenced and impressed by Aquinas's philosophy of nature, which is, physics. They hold that there has to be some pre-metaphysical demonstration of immaterial being in order to know that these neutrally immaterial have applicability.
So we can only think about them when we know of some immaterial reality to which these categories would apply. Otherwise, we only know them as applying to material things. So that means, we demonstrate the immateriality of the soul, or we demonstrate the existence of God from an argument, from a physical argument, from motion. Whereas what I think Aquinas is actually arguing is that these categories, in principle, are not subject to matter and motion. So there's nothing about the nature of substance, potency, form, and act, which says that they must be found amongst material things, which roots them in matter. So there's nothing about the intelligibility of these notions, which entails that substances have to be material. Substances are material, and we know that because there's material substances, but there's nothing about the nature of substance as such, i.e., that of which nothing, that which is, now how does it go? That which is such that it exists in itself and doesn't exist in another. There's nothing about that intelligibility as such, what means a substance has to be material, because that could equally apply to an immaterial thing, even if we don't know an immaterial thing exists. It's just that there's nothing about that category that entails that it has to be material. Same for potency, same for form, same for act, same for unity. So it's something about the intelligibility of these notions as such that entails that they're neutrally immaterial. Now, how do we know about these notions? Well, certainly we look out in the world, the world proportionate to our senses, and we see substances, we see potency, we see form, we see act, we see unity, and then we think about what it is to be a substance. So you just had, what I said there, that which is such that it doesn't exist in another, but exists in itself. Okay, that's the nature of substance. But now, we just think about that nature. We've discerned that nature from material substances, but now we just think about that nature, and we do what Aristotle does in the categories and in Metaphysics Book 7, and we do what Thomas does, Metaphysics Book 7 and lots of other places. And we think through that notion of substance, and we realize that we can think through that in all its intelligibility without involving matter and motion. So there's no necessity that category has to be applied to material things, in which case it could apply equally to immaterial things if they exist. So it's something about the intelligibility of these various categories which signify the neutrally immaterial themselves, which entails that they can be separated from matter and motion, not that we have to find some instance of immateriality where the category is applied in an immaterial way.
Gotcha. All right, I think that we're coming near towards the end of the episode, and I was hoping maybe we could discuss how Aquinas' understanding of the division of speculative sciences might apply to how we talk about philosophy and metaphysics today. And I specifically wanted to ask, is Aquinas, we've been referencing his exposition on Boethius' De Trinitate, and I wanted to ask, is Aquinas sort of undertaking what some philosophers might call a meta-metaphysics, like sort of investigating the possibility of metaphysical knowledge, or is that an anachronistic reading?
I do think that in Thomas you will find an answer to the Kantian critical question. I do think that's the case. Now, I think it's transcendental realism, but I do think that the Kantian critical question, what are the conditions for the possibility of our knowledge of some subject matter? And I do think that generally in Aquinas' thinking, you will get an answer to that. I am very keen on that. And I think that answer, converges with a lot of the things that Kant says in the Critique of Pure Reason, diverges in some very important ways, and in some very key ways, which leads Thomas towards realism, what I would say is transcendental realism, and leads Kant towards transcendental idealism. So I do think there's an answer to the critical question in the thought of Aquinas, but I don't think that's what he's doing in the De Trinitate. At least I haven't been able to frame what he's doing in the Trinitate as dealing with the critical question. Because what I think Aquinas is doing in the De Trinitate is just good old-fashioned philosophy of science. Just, what is science? How do we divide up the sciences? How do we demarcate the sciences? What are the methods of the sciences?
Right.
I think that's what he's doing. So it's the same kind of thing that Aristotle did in the posterior analytics. And it's the same kind of thing that other philosophers of science are doing today, although they're taking science in a much more narrow fashion. So he's engaged in the same sort of task that, Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, Bas van Frazen, Imre Lakatos, and people like that, Nancy Cartwright. He's doing the same project that they are doing, although he takes science and in a much wider signification than they do, because they're thinking of natural science. Not all of them. I mean, some of them take science to be applicable to domains outside of natural science. So he's engaged in a philosophical investigation of what the subject matters of these sciences are and what their methodologies are. And that's not exactly answering the critical question or taking up the critical question. But the converse of that is that, in answering the critical question, one will have something to say about the methodologies of science. So you heard me at the beginning talking about how knowledge involves some sort of necessity and universality, how the content of perception is the content of knowledge, and so being is what brings into operation our intellects. They're all part and parcel of Aquinas' answer to the critical question, i.e. how thought about reality is possible. And then being answers to the critical question and explaining how thought about reality is possible, that will have a knock-on effect on what Aquinas thinks of the divisions and methods of the sciences. But in depicting the divisions and methods of the sciences, I don't think Aquinas is answering the critical question. All right, then.
And another question I wanted to ask was, how would Aquinas understand epistemology? Would he because obviously in this threefold division, epistemology isn't seen as a speculative science as well. But would Aquinas have seen epistemology as an autonomous science in its own right, with its own subject matter? Does its subject matter fall under one of the other sciences? Is it at all anachronistic to assume epistemology is a science at all for Aquinas? What do you think?
So you remember when we got to that third science, metaphysics, okay, it considers the neutrally immaterial. So these categories: substance, potency, form, act, unity, all the rest. Okay, I kind of emphasized when we were there that this is first or primary philosophy. Okay, this is primary philosophy because this gives intelligibility to all the other branches of philosophy. All right, so because this articulates the nature of being, what it is to be, every other branch of philosophy then is dependent on metaphysics for its intelligibility. As Aristotle says in Metaphysics Book 7, the question that has always been the question of philosophy is, the question of substance. What is substance? Or, well, what is ousia? Or you could say being or ens. That is the question in philosophy. And that's what Thomas takes the question to be. What is being? Once you can understand being, then you can do the other branches of philosophy. So metaphysics, it's primary philosophy, but it's not the only philosophy. So after metaphysics, but still falling under philosophy, then you have what you could call second philosophy. And that's where epistemology would fit in for Aquinas. Because once we know the nature of being, we can inquire into how being can be understood. And whenever you read any of Thomas's epistemological writings, it's just full of all this metaphysical reasoning. He's drawing from his metaphysics already undertaken to explain how it is that a particular being, human beings, rational beings, can know something about being itself. And, he articulates it in terms of, the rational soul is the form of the body, and the agent intellect is grasping the form, by means of intelligible species, which it deposits in the possible intellect and thus actuating the possible intellect. All metaphysical terminology. So epistemology falls under metaphysics as second philosophy. Once we've done that, once we know the nature of being and how it is that we know being, then we consider how we ought to act in relation to being, how we ought to live. And that's, that takes us into ethics, and we're into practical philosophy then. And that brings us right back to the first division of the sciences between the speculative and the practical. As applied to philosophy, we have those speculative sciences, metaphysics and epistemology, the nature of being and how it is that we know being. And once we know the truth about that, then we can put that into practice. So the speculative contemplate the truth, the practical put the truth contemplated into practice. And so ethics follows up on that. So ethics comes, later after we've already done this groundwork. And then logic is just regulative for the whole domain, because logic tells us the rules of right reasoning and demonstration within a science with its own proper subject matter. So that's where I think epistemology would fit in for Aquinas. And it certainly is a science insofar as it considers a particular subject matter under the subject matter of philosophy itself, which is being in itself.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. There's two more questions I wanted to ask you.
Yes.
What would you say is the biggest difference between Aquinas' understanding of metaphysics as a science and metaphysics as understood today? Would you say perhaps that maybe contemporary metaphysics is, I don't want to say less systematic, but doesn't really consider what's sort of the main subject matter of it as a science?
Yeah, no problem. So aside from, all us Thomists and scholastics, there are two big traditions in philosophy. There's the analytic and the continental tradition, more or less, though, whether or not those signify systematic divisions, historical divisions, personality divisions, they're just there and we have to deal with them. Now, analytic philosophy, really, I think since Quine published Two Dogmas of Empiricism, has, had enjoyed a resurgence of metaphysics. And this is in a twofold way. In one way, you had the likes of Saul Kripke and Alvin Plantinga showing how modality can be respectable. Once again, how we can talk about necessity and contingency in a respectable kind of way. So you had Saul Kripke with, what was it, naming and necessity. Was it meaning and necessity or meaning and necessity? I think it was naming and necessity, and it was Carnap that wrote meaning and necessity. Yeah, so Kripke writes naming and necessity, and he shows how we can respectably use terms such as necessity, contingency, accidentality, and all the rest. And he does so by appeal to possible worlds, and Alvin Plantinga does something similar. And what they noticed is that we can be committed to a kind of essentialism with all this possible worlds talk. Because to take the stock example from Kripke, we can talk about Richard Nixon in this possible world, which is the actual world. And Richard Nixon was the president of the United States in this world. But there's lots of other possible worlds in which Richard Nixon exists, where he's not the president of the United States, but he's still Richard Nixon. So all those features of Nixon, which designate Nixon rigidly, designate Nixon and only Nixon in the possible worlds in which he exists, are necessary or essential to him, and those which designate him in only some but not all of the worlds are not necessary but contingent to him. And so that paved the way then for talking about the being of things, because there now we're talking about the being of Nixon. There is something about Nixon's being such that, he has these rigid designators. He couldn't be without these in any possible world. So we're back to the talk about beings again, and that's modal metaphysics. Also in the analytic tradition, you have another way of doing metaphysics, and this was a way proposed by Quine. And Quine held that the ontological question is really the question of what there is. And to figure out what there is, we basically take our most respectable disciplines, science and mathematics, we regiment their propositions within, first-order predicate logic, and then we interrogate these sentences in first-order predicate logic to see what we're ontologically committed to, what things need to exist in order for these propositions of first-order predicate logic, which are translations of scientific and mathematical propositions, what things do these need to exist in order for these to be true? And that tells us what we're ontologically committed to. And that's another way of doing metaphysics. So that's the analytic philosophical tradition. Now, what you'll notice about that, there is no subject matter to metaphysics there. We kind of stumble upon metaphysics by doing other things, but there is no subject matter which we have before us, which we investigate. Because for none of these, and these are like the dominant ways within the analytic tradition of doing metaphysics, Because for none of these thinkers can we just think about the being of things. Because the being of things for these thinkers isn't a philosophically interesting notion. Even when you get the actualists in analytic philosophy like Robert Adams and even somebody like Plantinga, who hold that there is something interesting about actuality. But what's interesting about actuality is that this world obtains as opposed to all the other possible worlds. So the other possible worlds are sort of intelligibly more fundamental than the actual world, and there's something special about actuality because it stands off from all the other possible worlds. So there is, you're not really thinking about the being of things, and so you're not considering being as a particular subject matter for investigation, and the same is the case with Quine and on what there is. So doing metaphysics in that way isn't doing metaphysics as Thomas or indeed as Aristotle envisaged it. It's just stumbling upon some metaphysical conclusions when you're doing some other philosophical enterprise. Contrast that with the continental tradition, and the continental tradition is wild and varied, but there's an important thinker in the continental tradition called Martin Heidegger that I'm sure a lot of people know. And, you know, he's a follower of Husserl and phenomenology. And what he undertook in Being and Time was a phenomenological investigation, a phenomenological ontology, basically, a phenomenological investigation of the being of beings. What is it for beings to be? And we can't answer the question of the being of beings by positing some other being there, because it's the being of beings that we're trying to figure out. So there must be something about the being of beings which is significant for philosophy, and we need to think that through in a phenomenological way. And it's this approach to metaphysics which comes closer to the Thomistic approach, because I think this approach to metaphysics at least allows for a subject matter, which is being, to be thought through and problematized and dealt with as its own branch of philosophy. Whereas I've argued in publication, I don't think analytical philosophy allows us, to do that. Analytical philosophy analytical philosophy can't take seriously or can't think its way into some unanalyzable fundamental reality that one must confront and consider. It always tries to consider some reality by means of some other reality, which is explanatorily more basic, but there's nothing more explanatorily basic than being. Now, I know a lot of, my analytic philosophical friends are going to cringe at that, and, they're going to say, hold on a minute, I do metaphysics in the way you describe, and I do metaphysics like this, and I do metaphysics like that. And I was on one of their podcasts, and my response is, well, great, you're a philosopher. What makes you an analytical philosopher then? And this is my hang up, because I find a lot of analytical philosophers are proud. Well, maybe not proud, but they're keen to call themselves analytical, philosophers, to distinguish them from whatever other kind of philosopher that there is. But in calling themselves analytical philosophers, a lot of them will say that by analytical, we don't mean Frege, we don't mean Russell, we don't mean Quine, we don't mean this, we don't mean that, but we mean something, but it's not any of this. And as I argued in my International Phil Quarterly article, it seems to me that notion of analytical philosophy is a double indexical definition of analytical philosophy, that analytical philosophy is any particular piece of philosophical activity which interests me right now. And that's what analytical philosophy is. If I, as a self-identified analytical philosopher, started doing philosophy the way Heidegger did, then Heidegger would be an analytical philosopher. And that's the kind of idea. Whereas I'm making the point that either analytical philosophy is something substantive which has an identity to it, or it's not. If it's substantive and it has an identity, it has a set of core commitments. And from all the sort of analytical philosophers that I've met, their core commitments, they can't or don't do metaphysics in the way Aquinas does, because being can't be problematized, because there's nothing more fundamental than being by means of which it can be understood. That's if we take, analytical philosophy to be committed to a set of substantive commitments. If we take analytical philosophy as just being any piece of philosophical reasoning that I, as an analytical philosopher, am interested in right now, then it has no significance. There's no meaning to it.
Right.
You're just doing philosophy. You're just being a philosopher.
Right.
So
Go
go
ahead.
on.
It just seems at that point that analytic is just a name that you add to your credentials, but it doesn't signify anything apart from just general philosophy.
Yeah. It would be as if I were to say that I'm an existential thomist and I'm not a transcendental thomist, but that's just daft. I'm a thomist, and at times I, sort of like, sort of the metaphysical issues in Thomas, which the existentialist thomists engage with. But at other times, especially when I'm engaged in epistemology and doing the Kantian stuff, I find that I have an awful lot in common with the transcendental thomists. And, God forbid, whenever I do, philosophy of nature, I find I have a lot in common with the river forest thomists. My sort of point is that, okay, you can call yourself a thomist because you've got a body of writings there that you can point to and refer to and say, this is substantively what I'm committed to. But once you start adding in all these little qualifications like existentialist, transcendental, river forest, or like with philosophy, analytical, continental, scholastic, or whatever, I don't think they have an awful lot of meaning to them unless you can point to a substantive set of texts or a substantive set of doctrines which characterize them. And so the reason why I kind of got down this rabbit hole is because I am addressing a way of doing metaphysics in contemporary philosophy, which is by and large analytical philosophy. And I'm arguing that these ways of doing metaphysics just are not the way Thomas did metaphysics, because Thomas treats being as a subject matter. And I don't see analytical metaphysics as doing that. Analytical metaphysics seems to be interested in problems which are traditionally metaphysical, but doesn't engage with a subject matter, which is being. And so this is just a word off any of my analytical friends who say, hold on a minute, I'm an analytical philosopher, but I do the sort of metaphysics you're doing. My sort of point is that, well, you're a philosopher. Right. I don't know about your being analytical unless you can explain to me what that is. So right. that's kind of why I'm, just sort of, emphasizing that point. It's a bit of a bugbear of mine about analytical philosophy.
Well, it definitely makes sense, and it's interesting that you say that sort of continental philosophy, because it wants to study the being of beings, is much more much closer to the metaphysics that Aquinas is undertaking. Would you say though that as I understand it in continental philosophy, especially I think with Martin Heidegger, there's a sort of suspicion of sort of attempting to demonstrate God's existence or really speaking meaningfully about God as sort of a projection of our concepts onto something that we can't understand. I think he calls it Ontotheology, but I could be mistaken.
So I want to make, again, a sort of qualification here that just as much as I don't like talking about analytical philosophy, because I don't know what analytical means there, I don't like talking about continental philosophy because I don't really know what continental means, because, a lot of our classic analytical philosophers were from the European continent. Right. And so they're continentals, but yet they're not part of continental philosophy. So I just don't like those terms. I will talk about philosophers though. And so you bring up Heidegger. So I can talk about Heidegger's philosophy. Happy enough to talk about that. And so, yes, in Heidegger, there is this charge of ontotheology. And so ontotheology is basically asking the question of the being of beings and answering that by positing some sort of being to explain the being of beings. And Heidegger thinks that, we do that when we say that God accounts for the being of beings. Now, the problem I think of that objection, and it's one that we have to take seriously, is that whilst, yes, we need to think through the being of beings, that's right. There we have a subject matter. We're thinking about the being of things. And so that's what Thomas is doing. And I think that's what Heidegger's doing. I think, Heidegger's a notoriously delicate thinker to get right. But I think that's what Heidegger's doing in Being and Time. So I think they're engaged in the same sort of project. But Heidegger's charge of ontotheology, I just think is ill-founded against Aquinas, because Heidegger thinks that when Aquinas talks about God as the cause of the being of things, that God is just another being, just another ends, like any other ends, just different in degree, but the same in kind.
Right.
But as we know for Thomas, God is pure existence itself, pure esse itself, and anything which exists is fundamentally different and other from that and only exists because it participates in the existence granted to it by God. So what you have here is that you have some being of a fundamentally different kind. So it's not just another being of the same kind, but different in degree. It's a fundamentally different kind. And I think that helps us avoid the charge of ontotheology. And indeed, I think in a number of important places where Heidegger does talk about the being of beings, he comes very close to talking about what Thomas would understand esse, the act of existence, to be. And, I know in several Heidegger reading groups that I've been in, trying to grapple with Heidegger is difficult at the best of times, to try and see what he's trying to say, because he's so precise. He is so precise with what he means that if you don't get the meaning, you're not going to follow his reasoning. Sure. So we're following this and we're reading this, and it seems, and they're saying, I just can't see how he avoids going down the Thomistic route of the active existence of things when he talks about the being of beings. But he wants to avoid that anyway. So Heidegger's an enigma of himself. But I think Aquinas can avoid the charge of ontotheology, because God isn't just another being added to explain the being of things, different in degree but the same in kind. He's a fundamentally different being. So I think that's enough to avoid ontotheology.
Right. That definitely makes sense. I think that's the point that Thomas Joseph White makes in his book Wisdom in the Face of Modernity. Yeah. All right. Well, the last question I just wanted to ask is for the listeners, is there any literature you'd recommend to? I think we I don't want to say exhaustive, but it seems like we've really covered a good chunk of what Aquinas is after in the speculative sciences and how we understand science. But if listeners want to engage with or study more, is there any literature you'd recommend? I know that we've referenced his exposition of Boethius's De Trinitate a few times, but is there anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, so the main place where Aquinas deals with these issues is in the commentary on Boethius's De Trinitate. I think it's questions 5 and 6, which have been translated by Armand Maurer as the divisions and methods of the sciences. John Whipple has an excellent treatment of this in his book, The Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas. Right at the very beginning, he goes into the subject matter of metaphysics, the divisions of the sciences, and how the sciences engage. And indeed, my understanding of these issues has really been fueled by Whipple's treatment of it. So I think Whipple's treatment is just excellent. Rudy Tevelde has a new book out, which I've read, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but Rudy Tevelde's new book, Metaphysics is in the title, Metaphysics and Transcendental, and Thomas is in the title. But for the life of me, I don't have the book in front of me right now. Here it is. Metaphysics Between Experience and Transcendence, Thomas Aquinas on Metaphysics as a Science. And I think that's a pretty good treatment. Now, Tevelde points out in it that he disagrees with me on a few things. And I wrote a recent review of it saying that, the author says he disagrees with me, but I don't disagree with him. So I don't know where the disagreement lies.
Wonderful.
So he says he disagrees with me, but then I don't disagree with him.
Sure.
So, and I don't disagree with him at the points where he says he disagrees with me.
So, like a misunderstanding, right?
Yeah, I don't know where that is, but anyway, that's a good book. I would really recommend that book, and I think that's probably the most up-to-date engagement with this of metaphysics as a science. And he goes through basically most of the questions that we've gone through in this discussion. So I'd really recommend that along with Whipple, and that'll really help with some secondary reading as well.
Wonderful. Dr. Kerr, thank you so much for joining us.
Not a problem. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.